Hello, and welcome to the Final Ghost podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost and your podcast host. Over the next few months, we're tracing the lineage of female monsters in horror cinema, and in each episode, I'm joined by a special guest to dive deep into a monster movie or two. Today's a very special episode for me. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do the season in the first place, and one of my personal favorite horror films, possibly ever. I'm talking about Ginger Snaps. This Canadian werewolf teen horror, which premiered 20 years ago this year, is, for me at least, one of the very best werewolf movies out there. It's certainly the most interesting one. The film centers on the Fitzgeralds, two death-obsessed sisters, outcasts in their suburban community, who must deal with the tragic consequences when one of them is bitten by a werewolf. There is so much going on in this film. It's smart, it's funny, it's violent, and at the heart of it, this complicated, conflicted sibling relationship between Bridget and Ginger. If you're into gnarly creature effects, this is a film for you. If you're interested in teen angsty vibes, also a good shout. And if you're a recovering emo, then this is a perfect throwback film. I'm extremely pleased that I'm joined in this episode by writer and co-host of the Faculty of Horror podcast, Alexandra West, to try and unpack Ginger Snaps. As always, our conversation will contain spoilers. And if you take away one thing from this series, it's to go and watch Ginger Snaps. Alex, thank you so much for making the time for joining me to talk about Ginger Snaps.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here in our respective virtual spaces.
Yes, that is a wonderful way of putting it, and I've not at all been absolutely fangirling over you just before hitting record. So we're going to be talking all about Ginger Snaps in this episode.
Out by 16 or dead in the scene, but together forever.
United against life as we know it. Let's get out of here.
What was it?
A big dog, maybe?
Whoa, that's it? Whoa.
Think you see werewolves a lot?
Did I change last night? Howl at the moon.
How do you feel?
Wicked.
It's, low-key one of my favorite horror films, but I wanted to ask you about your relationship with the film. When did you first watch it, and how has your opinion of the film evolved over the years?
So I first kind of, stumbled onto Ginger Snaps when I was in my teens. I mean, it came out in 2000, so I would have turned 15 that year. And I think I saw it on video or Blu-ray or Blu-ray. We didn't have Blu-ray back then. I saw it on DVD or something similar, probably a couple years later. And it's something that it's an interesting film because I love it in and of itself, but then I also love it as a Canadian. It's one of the, I think, many great emblems of Canadian horror. And so I always feel a lot of pride when I get to talk about it. And I continue to appreciate the film. The older I get, the more subversive, the more taboo breaking I see that it is. And it's such a rare film in so many ways. And I think, if anything, to me, it crystallized what it was like to be a teen girl when I was a teen girl. And then looking back and, rewatching it recently, it still holds a place of like, God, yeah, that's what it was like to be a teen girl. I didn't have like a Mean Girls experience. I didn't have that. It felt a lot more primal and strange. And I think that's what Ginger Snaps, for me, captures.
You mentioned so many things there, and some of them I'm definitely going to ask you about in a bit, but you mentioned that it feels like a rare film. What do you think makes it so rare?
I think at the most basic level, like just talking about having a period, it's still a very taboo subject for people. And so I think just the conversation around having a period is really impactful. And it's really important because, as we all know, not every woman menstruates. But for those of us who do, it is something that we're kind of always told to keep private. It's something that's hidden away. It's something we're not meant to share. And so just the fact that there's a conversation and a main plot point around a character menstruating, quite revolutionary to me. It was, it was like, oh, I'm also getting my period and it also hurts like a motherfucker. That feels great to at least see that recognized.
Yeah, it really kind of makes it literally makes the period into an actual curse that transforms this teenage girl into an actual monster. How do you think it uses the female body as both something that is sexualized by other people specifically and that is deemed monstrous, and that becomes ultimately in the figure of Ginger as the actual monster of the film?
Well, I think it's a really interesting journey through the Kristeva notion, or her utilization of the abject, a site of disgust, horror, but we're also finding Ginger very attractive. She's becoming more confident. And I also think it's so interesting that the Beast of Bailey Downs comes for Ginger when she has her period, because it can smell the blood. And that's, it's these things that we don't want to talk about, which ultimately kind of keep returning to us because, as Robin Wood says, it's the return of the repressed. And not to mix too many horror scholars in one conversation, but in thinking about the abject is something that is debased, it is reviled. Often women's bodies are considered abject. I think a really interesting example of the abject is when, certainly back in my day, when there were commercials for period pads, they would use blue liquid rather than red because the red was deemed like upsetting. Whereas it's like, God, I look down a couple days a month at my underwear and I can see that. And, I'm told that's disturbing. And so we are kind of taken on this journey with Ginger that is about self-discovery. It's about sexuality. It's about power. It's about hunger. It could be about addiction. And we are told that, or the society around her seems to think these things are really bad and meant to be really scary. Whereas I think the film itself, and I think for myself and a lot of people who watch it, it's not that what she's doing is good, killing people, but she's definitely, I don't think, a bad person. And I don't think she's a bad, evil monster. She may be monstrous, but I don't think she's evil.
Well, let's dig in, if we can, a bit into the Fitzgerald sisters, Ginger and Brigitte. So what do you think of them as characters and their relationship in particular?
It feels like a really honest relationship. It feels, where they have their closeness, they also deviate from each other a lot. They have conflict. They also protect each other and they die for each other. And, that's kind of what they're asked of each other in the end. And I think there's a very special, complicated bond that is portrayed on screen through this relationship. And it's one of the, it's a complicated female relationship. And I think there's something very special about that. And also the depth of sisterhood, because so often in mainstream media, we are wanting to pit women against each other. But this film, while it's showing a complicated female relationship, doesn't truly, in my estimation, pit Ginger and Bridget against each other. It shows that they're in conflict, but they're trying to reconcile it, or it's certainly Bridget is. She's not willing to give up on her sister.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk a little bit about their respective character arcs, which I always found really interesting because Ginger is could be deemed from as both the protagonist and the monster of the film, and Brigitte is a kind of more passive character that's reacting to her. But I've always sort of disagreed and seen them as equals, and if not Brigitte, more of a protagonist, really, or like a secret protagonist in the film. And I wanted to know what you think about their respective journeys throughout the film, and kind of how they end up and how they relate, the tension in their relationship evolves and cracks eventually.
Yeah, I think, because they are so deeply linked together, Ginger's transformation necessitates a transformation in Bridget. She can't go on the way she is because, while she's dark and interesting and very much alive, she's much more of an introvert, and I think plays a more prototypical final girl kind of role in this film. And she is the audience viewpoint because audiences, we don't have a lot of experience turning into werewolves, but we have experience with conflict, feeling confused, trying to help someone when they're in a bad situation. Those are all very human things. So, I think Bridget offers us a way through this film and a journey through this film that feels very familiar and human, and it allows us to be a bit of a voyeur through Ginger's much more fantastical transformation. We get to have that bit of thrill seeking.
Yeah, and one of the things I remember when I watched it as a teenage girl for the first time, one of the things that really struck me was obviously the way that they were pitting themselves against everyone else in their high school. And my relationship with the film has evolved, and I've seen so many new things and layers to it as I've rewatched it over the years and growing up. But when you're watching it as a teenage girl, one of the things that really strikes you is that they are very much misfits and outsiders, but also not necessarily presenting themselves as victims of bullying or of the mean girls. They fight back, and they're just as aggressive as the bullies in their high school. And the other aspect of them that I found also very interesting is the fact that they're so death obsessed and very morbid. Like that title sequence, that the title credit sequence of the film is visually very different from the rest of the movie. And it's also an interesting one because it is entirely from their perspective. It's their project for their school class. And I wonder if you had any thoughts about kind of their personas within kind of this high school environment and how they fit, or maybe even created sort of this image of these gothy, morbid girls.
So I think one of the things that this film does really well, and certainly something I very much related to when I was in high school and then seeing this film, is that I didn't have a particularly bad high school experience, but I didn't enjoy it. I was mainly pretty bored the whole time, and I was like anxious to get out of it and do something more interesting or more attuned to my interest. So even what is their quote, out by 16 or dead on the scene but together forever, like that I think resonates to me because and that's actually part of the tragedy of this film, is they understand that there is an out, and they have to fucking drive for it, and they need to get there and go. And that they need to essentially survive high school, and then they can go on and do whatever the hell they want. And I think the tragedy is that it's not that high school consumes them, it's their circumstance consumes them. And being in this insular small town, they were out trying to prank people, and got bitten by a werewolf. It's a tale as old as time. But their foresight into their future, their desire for a future, is what's so interesting. To me, certainly made them very relatable. And I think, what ultimately becomes very tragic for Bridget as you jump into the sequels, you see what happens to her. That
the other kind of part of the question that I was getting at is kind of their morbid obsession with death. And how do you think kind of that plays into the way that they exist kind of almost as their own archetypes in teen movies?
Yeah, I think there is a kind of sex, death, rock and roll fascination that the media certainly likes to lob at teens. I think death is possibly a more interesting interest for the characters to have over something like horror films, which, was all the rage with Scream and the self-referential style at the time. But I think the death and the setting of the suburbs, the notion like dead on the scene or, out by 16, all of this stuff, there is a kind of a sense of the tactile nature of life that they both have, even though they kind of sneer at so much of the bullshit they put up with, or are forced to put up with for the time being. There is a sense that there is something else to be had in this world, and that they want to go for it. They want to do something else with it rather than remain in a suburb and exist there.
You mentioned suburbia quite a bit, and there's something you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation kind of about it being a very important film in Canadian horror cinema in particular. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how do you think this works also as a suburban horror, and maybe even particularly as a Canadian suburban horror. It's something that I find sometimes gets forgotten about Ginger Snaps, maybe because of its international appeal, or maybe because it's very specific as well in that regard.
Yeah, well, I think it certainly functions as, for maybe a viewer who isn't Canadian or doesn't, go and read the Wikipedia page. It functions as a really great suburban horror film. And for that always means to me a kind of a necessitation of rebellion against a status quo, particularly a Reagan era status quo. I would also put Nightmare on Elm Street in the same category for that very reason. There was, the quote unquote white flight in the 70s and 80s to the suburbs, even before that, the 50s and 60s in North America, particularly in the States, but also in Canada as well, where people wanted to get away from what they perceived to be urban violence, which was really just scare tactics, wanting to kind of shift baby boomers away from, a certain type of racism, and you could escape and you could go and, seemingly live this very safe life. And it's, a very strange notion to have. And I think it kind of speaks to this isolated community and the fear, the monsters, the damage, the violence that can be present within it. And the shock is that we all went to these places. We all moved to these places to be safe. And now there's a fucking werewolf. What the fucking fuck? And it's a very notion of that kind of like the drawbridge is up. We're all up in the castle. We're fine. And then to see that become scary, to see it become violent, to see it become unsafe is, I think, an inherently unsettling thing.
And what do you make of the relationship with the Fitzgerald sisters with their parents?
I really, really enjoy the parents in this film, particularly Mimi Rogers as the mom.
Yes.
She's just so tonally perfect as this almost pseudo Stepford wife, but by the end of the film, the audience, certainly I feel like I've seen enough from this character to know, like, oh, she's actually way more savvy than anyone has given her credit for. And I think that's certainly the journey that I went on with my parents. And I think a lot of people go on with their parents when, if you're growing up and you're like, oh, mom, oh, dad, you don't know what it's like. And then you get out and you get into the world a bit and you're like, no, we maybe didn't go through the same stuff, but you've been through your own stuff. And I see that stuff in you. And I think the kind of journey for Mrs. Fitzgerald is a really lovely one, and it's something you don't often get to see that much, where you've got a stereotypical archetypal kind of figure who actually is granted a certain amount of humanity and character.
I really enjoyed the way that this film blends kind of the teenage or almost preteen idea of kind of solving a mystery and trying to find a solution or an antidote for something, and the way that Brigitte goes on the same journey with Sam, the teenage drug dealer that she sort of has a crush on. What do you make of the way it kind of incorporates these teen movie tropes as well into this into the suburban horror scenario?
Well, I think they've always kind of been present. I mean, if you think back to Nancy Thompson figuring out who Freddy Krueger is, there is an aspect there, and I think the this is where horror often gets conflated with a thriller, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where I also don't think it's necessarily a wrong thing or a bad thing. There is an element to mystery because, if it takes a while for Freddy or Jason or Michael to be enough to watch, so that we're going to watch them just slash and kill all the teens in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
But in the early stages, you need a bit of mystery. You need to uncover, like, what is this thing? I find it very interesting that the film doesn't really go into, like, who was that werewolf? Who was that first werewolf
Mm-hmm.
that we encounter in the film? Obviously, the sequels try to tackle some element of that. But it's very much about this kind of mythology of folklore, things like that. It was, present in, Nightmare on Elm Street. It's present in films before that. It was present in Buffy, certainly the TV series.
Mm-hmm.
Having a big set happen in a library was very important to those stories. So I think you do get that there, that we need to see these characters go on a journey. We need to understand the mythology. We need to understand the mythology this film is presenting to us. And it's interesting to watch characters grow with knowledge. And that's what we want to see. How do they intake knowledge? How do they apply it? What do they try next? What works? What doesn't work?
And how do you think it actually updates the werewolf movie?
I think it feminizes it in a kind of riot girl, girl power kind of way. That was certainly very prescient when I was growing up as a young woman. Lilith Fair, all of that kind of stuff. There was a sense that you could be a woman, you could be angry, and your presence was valid. It's certainly in some spheres of popular culture. I do not say it was, welcome in every stage of culture, but I think there was a sense that at least women talking to other women and certain other communities, that, you could scream and shout and be popular, and other people felt the same way. So I think there is a sense that there's an anger, a societal critique, a modernity to this film that I find very vital and very interesting. And I mean, the original title of this thing was, the film was Wolfer Girls, but girls spelled like riot girl. And they which changed, obviously, in production, but I always kind of took it to have this like riot girl-esque mentality.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that before. And where do you think it kind of manifests? Because I could definitely sense the teenage anger of it, even rewatching it. But it always seemed very tinged with sadness for me. So how do you think the riot girl mentality and culture is visible in the film?
I think in the fact that they were creating art, they were creating content, they were active in those spaces, they were unapologetic, and they saw, again, like I was talking about, they thought about their future. They wanted to get out of this place. They wanted to go and do something else that wasn't here, where their art and their ideas would be appreciated. And the tragedy of this film kind of being that certainly Ginger dies at the end of the film. And so I think that desire to create, the desire to find your own community is certainly, to me, a few of the really big things I take away from Riot Girl, from that movement, and what I see present in Ginger Snaps.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about the performances, particularly Catherine Isabel and Emily Perkins. What do you make of their approaches to their characters?
I think they're great. I think they interact like sisters. They have that kind of easy bond and relationship, and I like how kind of outsider they feel without being like a caricature of themselves. And I think that's really cool. It's a hard thing to pull off, and I think it's notable that both of them are from British Columbia here in Canada. I believe they're both from Vancouver. I may be wrong on that. But because when the film was announced, there was such an outrage after Columbine that the Canadian Film Centre, where a lot of big creators got together to make this film, could produce such a violent film about teenagers. And so all the casting directors in Toronto refused, which is one of our main casting hubs, refused to have anything to do with it. So the production team was forced to quote unquote look elsewhere into one of the other major hubs we have here in Canada, and wound up finding the two, I think, most perfect actors for the role in Vancouver. And I don't know if you would have found them if you would have gotten to that same conclusion had you been doing all these big auditions with possibly more name recognizable actors in Toronto.
That's incredible. I didn't realize there was such a hubbub about the production of the film when it was first funded.
Well, I mean, Canadians, we get real uppity about what we fund, because certainly here in Canada, the government plays, and the funding bodies, the agencies that it employs, most notably in this case, Telefilm Canada, people get real uppity about it funding horror films, genre films. There hasn't been a big scandal about it, I don't think, in the last 10 years, I want to say. I could be wrong, but certainly in the last while, I haven't heard too much pearl clutching about it. But I mean, that goes all the way back to Shivers and Cronenberg and those films. But yeah, no, there was a real upset when Ginger Snaps or Wolfer Girls, it might have been at that stage, but when it was announced.
I wanted to go a little bit deeper into Ginger's transformation and kind of how she evolves and how her transformation is presented to us, because it is very much a transformation into a monster, into a werewolf in slow motion. She undergoes a lot of emotional as well as physical transformations and changes in her personality, in her demeanor, the way she carries herself. What did you think of this kind of extreme puberty that she goes through?
I think it's in many ways a very typical one for these kind of films. Essentially, when you have a female monster, not in every case, but to speak very generally about it, I find there's always a sexual component to it. Having a kind of sexuality, a power in sex, and I'm not mad at that. I don't think it's copping out, because I think all women, especially young women, are told that our sexuality is something to be fearful of. It's something to protect. It's something to, watch the guys around you. And it rarely, if ever, talks about sex as being pleasurable and being enjoyable and learning about what you like. So I think I think it's a very powerful message to show a transformation. I personally don't see Ginger and the transformation coded as evil, and to show this kind of power, to show a power that is I want to do it, and I want to figure out how to do it. Of course, it then takes a kind of turn into addiction and things like that. But these are all very pressing things that young people feel, and especially young women feel, because we are told to be the protectors and the caregivers. And so to watch someone kind of go through that journey, I think is really powerful. And I don't personally, when I watched it and now watching, in the multiple times I've seen it since, I don't feel like there's a lot of shame or stigma attached to it. It feels very honest.
Oh yeah, I don't see Ginger coded as being evil either. In fact, if anything, I find it really interesting that she, in this kind of slow motion transformation that she undergoes, it is involuntary, because her body is reacting to this, this werewolf's curse. But also she is kind of trying to manage it as well as possible, because it is uncontrollable and unstoppable. But also at no point is she actively, she does hurt people, but I found it interesting that she never actually hurts another teenage girl or another woman. There's only one point where one of their high school bullies dies, but that is an accident, and it's made very, very clear by the film that it's an accident. She only really attacks young men and, teenage boys, really. But it always feels like it's beyond her control. Like she's trying very hard to control this new power that she's growing into, and a lot of it is coded as sexual power, but it's always somewhat beyond her, which is where this theme or almost this reading of her as being an addict comes in. And it's only really something that I started seeing into it when I rewatched it as an adult, even in Catherine Isabel's performance. So I wonder if you think that there is kind of an element there of this unwilling transformation as perhaps a take on addiction.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. When she's kind of, I guess, saying at the end, like, she can't stop. That's, I think it's a really powerful, scary, and simple sentiment. And feeling out of control is a scary place to be, and it's a hard thing to be. It's a hard thing to watch a loved one go through, and we have to negotiate a lot of things around that. And I think there is a really visceral nature that this film captures about that need. That's not a want. It's not a desire. It's a need. And that's something that I think people are very scared of because we don't necessarily know how to fully treat it. We have ideas. We have some things that work, some things that don't. It's different for every person. And so to actually come really close to it is a very scary thing.
There's a larger kind of theme, I think, that you sort of mentioned a little bit before, and that I noted as well when I was thinking about this film. And it's kind of this idea of hunger, especially kind of this ravenous, uncontrollable hunger in women in particular, and be that for blood or flesh or sex or connection or just belonging. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about how you think this film explores the idea of hunger.
They have these desires. They have desires to move on, to go do other things in other places, but they have to wait a bit longer, and then these other desires begin to take over, and it becomes insurmountable, and the change becomes so noticeable that things have to change, or she has to die, so she dies. And I think the hunger thing is, it's we see in Mrs. Fitzgerald a kind of acceptance of the things in the past, and a way to be and a way to live. And I think the hunger can be construed as something wanting more. And society has a lot of feelings about people wanting more and how to keep them in their place. So um, I think this film shows a very real need for that hunger, that it's a natural desire, that it's, not necessarily that out of the realm of, being rational, but it's also something that is scary because there isn't a place for it. There isn't a place for Ginger other than her death or figuring out how she can be a human again.
I wonder what you think about how this film fits into our idea of the female monster on screen.
I think it's part of a tradition. I think it's kind of kicks off a more contemporary view of it. I think a very close relative of this film is something like Jennifer's Body, and it's creating female anti-heroes, and male anti-heroes have been around and glorified for decades, and I think kind of it's only been in the last few decades that female anti-heroes have become kind of a thing, and I think Ginger is a great example of one. That a monster is understandable, it is vital, it is something that is meant to shake up society. It is meant for us to question, why isn't there more space in society for other ways of being, rather than a very prescribed, societally accepted notion. And I think other films ask those questions too. I think Ginger Snaps kind of kicks it off in a new millennium kind of way.
How do you think this film actually, which came out in the year 2000, so 20 years ago, how do you think it fits into the trend of horror films that came just before it?
Yeah, I think it definitely pulls some elements from them. It kind of shares a similar aesthetic style, but it's not nearly as glossy or as kind of star powery as the other ones, and because it's essentially an independent production, they could be a bit more edgy in terms of uh, the sentiments and the way they talk
Mm-hmm.
about being a teenager and in terms of that kind of stuff. So when you don't have a big studio backing where you have to, hire a noticeable person, or
Mm-hmm.
notable person rather, um, but they could have a bit more. They could have a bit more freedom in the stuff they wanted to say and how they wanted to say it while still utilizing the really popular, cool things that people were into at the time. That a kid like me would have been like, yeah, I get this. I know that aesthetic. I want to partake in that. But it can do a bit more, even though I think there's some great elements to those films. But yeah, they can be a bit more subversive and a bit more edgy.
For people who don't perhaps have kind of the overview that you have of teen horror in the 90s and kind of early 2000s, kind of what were those broad strokes characteristics of teen horrors at the time, and how do you think Ginger Snap subverted them?
Yeah, no, I mean they're very the films of the horror films, the teen horror films in particular of the 1990s, are
Mm-hmm.
often studio made films, so they have a sizable budget, a budget that they are expected to recoup.
Mm-hmm.
They feature recognizable stars, whether that be a Neve Campbell who was on Party of Five, whether it be a Sarah Michelle Gellar who was on Buffy, a Jennifer Love Hewitt also on Party of Five. They have a bit of star power, a bit of clout to them, and they were very self-referential because as teens and preteens and horror fans in the 90s, we were existing with a fair amount of reverb back from culture. We were watching culture that was commenting on culture, so it makes sense that the horror films of that era would also want to comment on the stuff that was going on around them and call out that the characters actually had a knowledge of pop culture and could comment on the proceedings in front of them. Um, and so I think Ginger Snaps takes that kind of aesthetic, kind of slightly edgy but attractive way of being a teen. It's less glossy, it's a bit more unrefined, and also takes the kind of self-referential elements to it. The characters talking about in kind of slang and referencing various things in pop culture all over the place. So it feels quite normal to them and to us.
I wanted to kind of ask a much broader question, and mostly this comes from the one line that they say that very early on in the film when they're watching a horror movie. And there's something that Brigitte says to Ginger where she's like, you don't think our deaths should be more than cheap entertainment? And they're very freaked out by the idea of everyone just kind of staring at their dead bodies. And this comes kind of within the context of them working on their project, and which we see all of in the title credit sequence. But I think there's somewhat of a statement there about the relationship between women and women's bodies in particular and horror cinema. And I was wondering if that's what you thought of the way that Ginger Snap kind of comments either directly or indirectly on the relationship between women and watching themselves in horror cinema.
I think it definitely attempts to delve into the stories behind sensationalized stories that you can see deaths and women's deaths splattered all over the news.
Hmm.
And they are sensational and they can cause movements. They can also just be kind of news of the day. But to actually spend time with them to understand that these two young women are, in fact, people and humans, also revolutionary, that they have thoughts and feelings and things that they want to accomplish with their lives. And, a simple werewolf attack can derail those things. And I think on one hand, I think it wants to, with that line, it wants to acknowledge that there is a certain prescience of horror films. For me, those horror films mainly exist in the 80s when you get into some of the, especially the latter sequels of some of the major horror franchises where you're just watching character after character, and I use the term character a bit loosely here, even though I love those films,
Yes.
get killed off and killed off again and again and again, and it doesn't really matter. To me, what's interesting about the 90s teen horror cycle is that because you had some star power behind these characters, they were often given a bit more depth than their predecessors. Even as someone as beloved as Laurie Strode, didn't have a whole bunch of backstory, didn't have a whole bunch of character. It helped that she was played by a really talented actor in Jamie Lee Curtis, but it wasn't a lot of time spent on um, Laurie and her thoughts and feelings and the backstory and all of these things that happened to her until Halloween H2O. But I think they're kind of commenting on, to me in my mind, I take that line as something just a bit more of an older reading, a bit more of a popular culture kind of reading of horror films.
To start kind of wrapping up our conversation, I wanted to ask you kind of, what do you think? We've mentioned that Ginger dies, and this is something that happens to quite a lot, and I wouldn't try to generalize so much as to say that to every female monster on screen that I've encountered, but certainly to quite a few. Do you think that why do you think it's necessary for Ginger to die at the end of the film? If you think it is necessary at all.
I mean, I don't think it is. I think it's the way most of these films have wrapped up. I think it's hard to make a film where the monster survives at the end, because what then do you do with that monster? The monstrousness, just like in Jennifer's body, gets transferred over to someone else very close to them. But even then, it's their society doesn't have a place for people that it deems to be quote unquote monstrous. So I think that's often a challenge that films have, and even the most. And I can, there's plenty of films that I think are progressive and interesting, but in the end, have to have the monster die because there's almost no other way out. Because I think it's hard to tell a story with monsters kind of just being a part of the world unless you're like making a Hellboy movie and you're Guillermo del Toro. I think it's really tricky because it's hard to get. Films have to get financed. Films have to get made by a bunch of different people. So what better plot synopsis than it's about these two kind of misfit but really cool teen girls. One of them turns into a werewolf, goes through a whole kind of awakening. Her sister's trying to save her. Then at the end, the sister, who's not a werewolf, learns some stuff about herself, and the werewolf sister dies. Like, that's much more viable than, now we've got a world with a bunch of werewolves running around, because then you've got basically an underworld movie.
Without going too much into them, what do you think about the wider Ginger Snaps universe? And I'm obviously referencing the sequel and prequel that followed the original Ginger Snaps, Ginger Snaps 2 Unleashed, and then Ginger Snaps Back, the beginning.
So I wrote an article about them, which you could probably still find online. It was part of it's when I was writing for Shock Till You Drop, so I think it's now comingsoon.net. But you should be able to find them on there. So I think that's kind of where I downloaded most of my opinions about them. They're okay. They're not great. I wouldn't rewatch them.
That's fair enough.
That's my take. Yeah.
You've mentioned Jennifer's Body a few times throughout the conversation, and the parallels are very much there. How do you feel the influence or the legacy of Ginger Snaps in that film in particular?
I'm not sure if Ginger Snaps had a direct influence on Jennifer's Body, even though Jennifer's Body was written by Diablo Cody, who's seemingly quite a big horror fan. I think it would be fair to assume that Diablo Cody might have seen Ginger Snaps. I would not be surprised if she did. I think it's what I see there is two films struggling to tell a similar story. Ginger Snaps did next to nothing on its release, not a surprise for a Canadian film. However, it found its audience in like VHS rental, DVD rental, all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was similar for Jennifer's Body, but with Jennifer's Body, it wasn't a little Canadian film that was partially financed by the government. It was a major studio film by an Oscar-winning screenwriter that was seen as a flop. It had major stars, decent budget. So when it fell, quote unquote, upon its initial release, because as we all know the story of the shitty marketing, it it was seen as a much bigger fail, and it was seen that, oh, people actually don't want to watch this kind of movie. People don't want to go see it, so we won't make them. However, no one, or very few times, does Hollywood actually anticipate, oh my goodness, there's actually a huge cult following. Let's stay the course with this film, and let's champion it and celebrate it throughout all of its iterations, and not just its theatrical release.
To end kind of on a lighter note, and not two films that failed quote unquote at the box office upon their release, it's definitely, I mean, it sounds that it struck a chord with you as a teenager. It definitely struck a chord with me as a teen girl as well. It kind of continues finding its audience through people accessing it in different ways. What do you think about it is that about the original Ginger Snaps that strikes a chord even now?
I think in some ways it's a very simple film, and it's a simple story, but it's very well told, and the characters are really likable. The performances are great. I think if you like this film, you fall in love with the Fitzgerald sisters, and you see some part of yourself in them, and you care about them, and you want to see what they get up to and how they navigate these really strange, uncertain territories that the story takes them to. And then layering in some of the progressive feminist stuff we were talking about, the suburban aspects. These are all little like breadcrumbs throughout the story that make it feel more real and make it feel like an escapist version of a lived reality. And I think that's what we're always looking for. We're looking for something that feels familiar, but also takes us somewhere else. And I think that's what a good movie will do.
Alex, thank you so much for your time and for all of your incredible insight on Ginger Snaps. And where can people find out more about your work online?
So you can check out the Faculty of Horror that I co-host with Andrea Subasati. We're on all the major podcatchers. You can also find us at facultyofhorror.com. And for all the stuff I get up to on my own, if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at ScareAlex.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
And that is it for this episode of the Final Girls podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help a lot. And you can find out more about what we've got coming up over on thefinalgirls.co.uk. And you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Girls UK. You can also follow Alex on Twitter at ScareAlex. And I will be tweeting only about Ginger Snaps for the foreseeable future over on Anna Be Demented. Thank you for listening, and next week we'll be discussing a man-eater of a very different kind.